Today, I'm going to make a quick, kind of off the cuff, unscripted, unplanned, quick comparison between three camera bodies and actually three camera body and lens combinations that some of you may be considering. Some others may consider this an outlandish comparison. However, I think it's interesting nonetheless, so I wanted to kind of quickly make a video on it, just kind of rambling or firing off my thoughts on these three camera bodies and lens combinations to see if one compares favorably to the other. What's the difference in handling? What's the difference in weight, size, the whole total package here. So today I'm going to be comparing the X Pro 3, the Sony a7c, and the Leica Type M or M Type 240, bodies here. So, these two on the left here, this X Pro 3 and this a7c, these are probably a more kind of sensical comparison between these two camera bodies, considering how close they are in price and I guess the fact that this is Sony's first and only rangefinder styled body with a full frame sensor in it, so akin to their Alpha 6000 series, but now they've figured out how to cram the a7 III sensor inside of this. So at the price point of, I think this body alone brand new is about $1,700, and I don't even know what the Fuji X Pro 3 retails for now, but I'm thinking 15, 16, maybe 1,700, depending on the color finish you go for. That comparison kind of makes sense. Where you bring the Leica in is, from a price standpoint, even on the used market today, it's not really close to either one of these, right? Used, this M Type 240 goes for, I believe, anywhere from maybe 2,300 to 3,200 maybe, depending on the type and in condition of the body. Also depending on if you're looking at the Type 240 or the Type 262, which is very similar, or any special edition therein. So where these two the comparison for these two come in is, even if you look at these, the styling of these is pretty similar, right? Like, you got your classic rangefinder type layout on the Fuji. You actually have a rangefinder on the M body, and they kind of have a similar design philosophy. I think obviously the Leica is a lot cleaner, a lot of a more classic body here, but in the end, it's not outlandish to compare these two, at least from exterior appearances. Now, with the shooting experience, that may be a different story. We'll get into that in a little bit. But just from kind of piggybacking off of that comparison there, if we look at the external controls of each of these cameras, obviously on the Fujifilm we have an exposure compensation dial, we have our shutter speed dial, we have our ISO dial built into the shutter speed dial, we have our aperture on the lenses, typically on most of the Fuji lenses. So you got your exposure triangle at your fingertips here on the Fujifilm, which gives you that tactile feedback as you shoot, as you're out making your pictures. On the Leica, it's a similar story, but not exactly the same, right? You got your shutter speed, you've definitely got your aperture on the lenses, but the ISO, the body that came after this, the M10, has the ISO dial right here on the left side of the top plate, and they have not done that yet when it comes to this Type 240, and so you have to hold down a button down here, and you can scroll the wheel to change the ISO. So you have to kind of interact or look at the display or look at the camera, kind of know where you're at in order to adjust that. Nonetheless, they both have an automatic mode for the shutter dial, which basically kind of puts it into, you can put into shutter priority mode if you put the A on the lens on the Fujifilm, but over here will essentially put you into aperture priority mode, which you can do the same thing over here on the Fujifilm. Moving over to the Sony, you don't really get any of the actual physical dedicated dials besides the exposure compensation on the right side, same side as the Fujifilm. For exposure compensation, sorry, to jump back to the Type M or the M Type 240, for exposure compensation, you do have this rear dial that defaults as an exposure compensation dial. So that is an option. You do still have the ability to change that on the fly as you're looking through the viewfinder, and you do get feedback whether your exposure is under or over, and you know how many stops you're kind of under or overexposed in there. Of course, the display within that rangefinder here, this viewfinder, is definitely not as information dense as this one, but you do get a little bit of feedback here. So moving back to that Sony, you have the exposure compensation dial on the right side, and then depending on how you set it up in the menus, you'll have a dial on the back to control one variable, and then you of course have this this scroll wheel right here on the back that will give you another variable you can adjust. So me personally, I like to do my aperture on the back wheel because that's how I used to do it back on Canon way back when, like 10 years ago when I used to shoot Canon. And then I put my shutter speed on this back dial. And then the ISO is accessible with one button pressed to the right, or you can assign that to any of these buttons, or you can go into the function menu. It'll pop up on the bottom and you can have it as an option there, or you can dive all the way into the menu. So you have a few different ways you can customize this body, even though the a7c is the worst of the full frame bodies when it comes to customization, because you really only have this custom button down here, the trash can button, you have the record button, which you can set to a custom function, and then you have the four-way D-pad, which you can change the function of those, and I believe you can even change the AF1 button. So you have a few options, but you have to sacrifice some functionality to get that. On the Fuji film, when it comes to custom buttons, you have a button on the front here, which if you've watched my review of this camera, right now this is what I use for my as my AF1 button, because I like to use a thumb grip, and so I don't like to use back button focus. And personally, I don't think that the button layout on the back of this Fuji makes any kind of sense for back button focus. At least where my hands fall, the buttons are not really in a position to reach any of these comfortably and hold them down for continuous focus, for instance. So you have that front button you can change, you can set as a custom function. You have the back dial, which pushes in as a custom button. You have a button on the top next to the shutter button as a custom button, and then you have a button above the Q button as a custom button. On the older Fuji bodies, you used to have a D-pad that you can customize in the same way that you could on the Sony bodies. However, they removed that in this generation, and so you no longer have that option. You have way less custom functions on this camera as compared to the older generation, and even most of the A7 full frame bodies, of course, besides this A7C. On the Leica, no custom buttons. You're not getting any of that, right? They don't take custom orders here. It's their way or the highway. It's a very simple way of shooting. They give you, relatively quick access to all of the exposure, exposure triangle variables, and that's pretty much it. Focus is on you, you're on your way. That's it for Leica. So that's a quick, I guess, comparison of the functions and customization for these three bodies. What we should also talk about is the weight for these three, and for that I'll be right back. So for the weight, I thought I'd go ahead and grab a food scale here, so that we can kind of get the official weigh-in with these, comparing these three bodies with a battery inside, and then I'll mount up some pretty equivalent lenses, and we'll see how they compare with those. So let's start off with the Leica. So you put this up there, and of course all three of these bodies does have a body cap on it and a battery inside, and then I'll put some lenses on and we'll do this again. So for the Leica with no lens, you're looking at 24.3 ounces. Yeah, that's in ounces. Sorry, I'm American, so that's what we deal with. In grams, that's 690 grams. Okay, so jumping over to the X Pro 3, body is 17.8 ounces, so just over a pound, which would be 506 grams. for the a7c with battery in it, we're looking at 18.3 ounces, a little bit over a pound as well. Pretty close to the Fuji though, surprisingly. And then that would be 521 grams. So with that being said, let's go ahead and mount some lenses on these, some kind of comparable lenses within each lens lineup, and see how they stack up then. So for we'll start with the Leica. Okay, so for this one, I will be mounting a cheap little 7 Artisans 35 millimeter f2 lens. So this lens is it's actually a pretty interesting lens. It's very cheap. You can get this used for under $200, and it is a sonar design, I believe, so kind of borrowed from that old Zeiss sonar designs, and it actually has a pretty interesting rendering in my opinion. I actually really do like this lens, even though it does, optically it has a lot of shortcomings as far as vignetting, and it might even have some kind of like focus shift every now and then, but when stopped down it's really sharp, and when wide open, even for photos of people, it really gives an interesting rendering. So regardless, this lens right here, like most Leica mount rangefinder lenses, is pretty small, very tiny, very easy to fit into a bag and bring along with you, or sling it around your shoulder, even though this body is kind of a heavy body made out of all brass, and this lens internally is brass as well. It really is a small, compact package. It really feels great in the hands, even though ergonomically this thing is like a smooth brick, but because it has that nice heft, it allows you to really squeeze and hold on to it, and I don't feel like I'm in danger of dropping this combination. But I really do like the handling and simplicity of this. Big fan, especially if you don't mind having a thumb grip on this. It's a great experience. So anyways, for that, we're mounting that lens on the Fujifilm. We will mount the little Fuji Cron, the little 23 millimeter f2, so 35 millimeter field of view equivalent, to kind of try to match the Leica. And on the X Pro 3 body, it's kind of a match made in heaven as far as ergonomics and size. I think this lens was launched or shortly after launch with the X Pro 2, and so the way the body kind of tapers off here is definitely intentional, so that it doesn't impede much of your view from the optical viewfinder. So nice, lightweight, small, compact, weather sealed lens, and hopefully a formidable comparison to that cheap 7 Artisan lens on the Leica. So for the a7c, this is where things get a little different when you talk about autofocus, mirrorless full frame lenses. The size comparison can get a little wild, unless you start to talk about the 2.8 primes that are available, 2.5s, some of these smaller lenses that Sony and Sigma has been bringing for this lens mount. But in this case, I've mounted the Sony 35 millimeter 1.8 lens. I haven't had this lens for very long, but I really like it so far. Size wise, I feel like it's pretty comparable to the Sony Zeiss 55 millimeter, which is probably one of my favorite lenses of all time, if I'm being honest. And this one here shares a lot of similarities with that lens, in my opinion, just without the Zeiss badge on it. So aside from a size comparison, you can see right that this lens is a lot bigger than both of these we're comparing it to today, and that's kind of the trade-off you get. Sony is bringing a lot of these small bodies. For the longest time, they really didn't have any small lenses that went with it besides the Sony Zeiss 35 millimeter f2.8 and the Zeiss Loxia manual focus lenses. But now, over time, they've started to bring, them and other companies started to bring more and more small, lightweight prime lenses. None that are quite the size and of the Leica mount direct competitors, but I think that there's a trade-off there with most of them getting autofocus. You know, when you look at the Samyang line of lenses, Rokinon, Sigma. So just something to keep in mind if you're thinking about moving to a full frame Sony alpha body, particularly full frame, the full frame bodies in comparison to APS-C. There's a lot more lenses now that are coming out that are smaller. It's just you will sacrifice on the aperture typically when compared to a similar size lens on a Leica mount. Anyways, getting back to the weight comparison, let's go in the same order we went before. So the Leica with this little 35 f2 is now 31.4 ounces, and that is 891 grams. Okay, let's move on to the Fuji with the 23 millimeter mounted is 23.9 ounces, which equates to 678 grams. And then we'll move on to the Sony with the 35 1.8, and that is 27.9 ounces and 791 grams. So take that for what you will. Even though of these three bodies that we have in front of us, at least when you talk about the total package of body and lens combination, the Leica is the smallest, and it's also the heaviest, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. So looking at this top-down view here, though, you'll see kind of how the length of the lenses affect the volume in which the package takes up. So this is something to keep in mind if you're thinking about having a small, lightweight 35 millimeter package in your kit, and you know what kind of bag, what spaces can you fit it in. If you want like an equivalent 1.8 or f2 lens in any of these lineups, this is what that form factor will look like. And I will even turn these this way so you can see the front profile of these three bodies, and you'll see that the Sony is the shortest of all three, and I think the Leica is probably the second, and then the X Pro 3 is the tallest of all three of these combinations. So kind of interesting. The Sony is the shortest here, but if you throw an equivalent lens on it, it's the longest that way. The Fujifilm is the tallest this way, but it turns out, you know, when you throw an equivalent lens on it, it's somewhere in the middle when it comes to volume. And the Leica, which is middle in height of the camera body, is the smallest overall package, but also the heaviest, right? And the Fujifilm in the middle of the volume is also the lightest. And then for weight wise, the Sony combination, I think, was in the middle, if I remember correctly. So just some food for thought if you happen to be, you know, one of the two people in the world maybe who are actually looking at one of these, you know, one of these combinations versus another. Now you get to see them all three get handled and kind of see, you know, what the total volume and weight and handling between the three is kind of like. One thing that I wish that, and it looks like Sony, at least for the G Master lenses, are going this way. One thing I wish that Sony had done from the beginning is put their aperture rings on the lens. I know there's a lot of, I think Sony shooters now who are experiencing this, that some of them really don't like it, but that's something that I really have always loved. Being able to, you know, have a dedicated control over the aperture directly on the lens like it used to be back in the day. Your hand is usually always on the lens anyways, so I actually prefer that. On the other hand, you know, I'm not going to persecute people for wanting things differently than I do. You know, if you know, because I do like to do a lot of one-handed shooting, particularly with this X Pro 3, which is why I like how all the buttons and dials kind of fall, besides the ISO, it's not one-handed use, but kind of fall within one hand. So I can understand how somebody wouldn't want this on the lens because it forces you to put that hand up. And when you have a small, light, compact setup like this, it's kind of nice to be able to just shoot, kind of run and gun with one hand and get shots in a stealthy way, so that you don't interrupt moments as you're documenting. At least that's what I use these cameras for a lot, is documenting my daily life and my family life. And that is a nice kind of feature, the way that Fujifilm kind of was thoughtful in putting all the buttons on the right side. There's no reason for you to put your left hand up over here, but you do have to have that on the lens to change the aperture. But for me, it's not something I do very often, so set it once and forget it for a particular scene, and I'm good to go. Obviously with the Leica, it's definitely a two-handed affair. You have to, manually focus this thing with the rangefinder tab here, and line up the two images, the superimposed image on the patch, to get your, confirm your focus, and then you take the shot. So definitely no one-handed action going with the Leica camera, unless you're talking about like a Leica Q or a SL2 or something like that, some of their newer autofocus offerings. But any M body, it's not happening. You're always gonna have two hands on that, unless you pre-focus and then you use one hand to continue taking shots. But with the Sony, it does have, I think, a pretty comparable maybe philosophy to the Fujifilm, except with taking it one step further and them offering a lot of lenses that don't have the aperture control. And so on the lens, so that you can do everything with one hand. Your right hand can control aperture, ISO, and shutter speed without ever even taking your eye out of the viewfinder. So that is something that is, I think, kind of overlooked by a lot of people who turn their nose up at more modern digital cameras. Is there's a lot of benefits to having all the information in the viewfinder and having all this access with one hand to change all these settings, particularly if you find yourself in a quicker moving environments, kind of run and gun situations. If you're a type of person that likes to take their time, then it won't matter to you either way. You should be able to adapt to any of these bodies and use them to your heart's content. So other than that, I just want to do a quick physical comparison of these three bodies and lens combinations, and so hopefully that's helpful to somebody. And but before we go out, I think what I will do is maybe I'll cull through my catalog and figure out if I can put some sample images up of each of these three bodies, so that you can get an idea of the results that each one of these gives you. And hopefully that also might help inform somebody's decision, the one person or two people in the world who are looking at comparing some combination of this. So, at this point, before I roll the thanks for watching outro, I'll roll some sample images here if I can find any, and that'll be it. So before you go see that, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate your time. Oh, one more thing I almost forgot is when it comes to the shooting experience, is the kind of the back screen experience that you get from all three of these is similar but different at the same time. Now let me explain. So on the Type 240, most of the time this back display is off, obviously, because this camera is not doing full-time live view, basically like these other two are doing. It has a shutter that covers the sensor usually, and so that's not capable. It's not capable of doing that, even though it does have live view built in, as well as you can buy an EVF for the top shoe here, hot shoe here. So what happens is you take a picture, and if you have, you know, your standard settings of playback on or off, it'll display on the back. I think by default, typically it doesn't display anything on the back as you shoot, unless, which is a pretty cool feature for these cameras. So let's say I focus up and take a picture of this, and there we go. Right, nothing on the back. Now, if I half press and hold, or I hold that half press after I've gotten the shot, right, I take the picture and I hold it down, it'll display on the back for the duration that I hold that, and then when I let go, it'll go black again. So it kind of gives you on the fly, very finite control over whether you are reviewing your image or not. So it's kind of like you can kind of control on each individual shot whether you want to or need to chimp on the shot to make sure you've got it. Now, to be fair, one thing I didn't mention about these two is that this back LCD is garbage. In my opinion, it's bad by today's standards in particular. You got to remember, this is a 2013, 2014 camera, and the LCD quality was just obviously not their highest priority when it came to selecting the components for this body. But it's bad. It's not really good for checking focus when you zoom in. It's very pixelated. The colors on it are horrible. Everything looks washed out, unsaturated, and you look at your photo and you're like, why did I spend so much money on this? But then you load the raw files up onto your computer and everything makes sense again. So just keep that in mind. If you've never shot one of these and you take your first shots and look at the back of the camera and you are supremely underwhelmed, you got to look at the actual files. The actual files from this are actually pretty good. They definitely have a certain depth or feeling to them that is kind of unique, but you know, I'm not going to get into that right now. It's not an image quality review, but yeah, the back LCD garbage, but kind of cool, that feature of being able to have press and hold so you can see your shot if you want to. Now, these I think are more similar, right? You have the Fuji X Pro 3 and the Sony a7c, and they both kind of at least have the ability to go back LCD hidden, which is the way I personally really prefer to shoot. I don't like the screen on all the time, eating up my battery, because I don't really use it to compose most shots unless they're at weird angles. Or I want to do some waist level shooting, which is nice for both of these cameras, right? With the X Pro 3, you flip it down and you have a nice waist level type viewfinder down there, or to review your images. It's actually really convenient. When you need it, it's a quick flip away. When you don't, it's up, and you just kind of have this sub LCD on the back that can display some settings or what film simulation you're in currently. That also resembles, you know, a film box holder from back in the day. So I like that, but at the same time, I might prefer what they've done here, because, you know, the novelty of that back LCD wears off. I don't usually put all the shooting information on the back because I can see it all on the camera, right? I can see the aperture, I can see the ISO, I can see my shutter speed all on the camera already. I don't know why I would need an info display on the back to display that. One thing that is useful, I guess, is your battery level and how many shots you have left, to be able to at a glance look down while the camera's off and know that. That's helpful. But I typically just keep it on what film simulation I'm on, because I really just bounce between kind of a custom recipe for a classic chrome and Acros when I want to shoot black and white. It helps me visualize that when I shoot it, so that when I get the raws, I can compare them to the JPEGs and get close to where I want to be and tweak from there. So while that's cool, the sub dial is nice and all, this one with just the plain flat back is nice, or nicer in my opinion, because when you really have a tough angle to work, right, you have way more options with this fully tilting and flipping screen here. And I've already used this a ton. I've been taking pictures to sell some other gear off, and it's been very helpful to be able to, you know, top down shot without having a tripod, be able to line this up, got my level up there, and I can see it without kind of craning my neck over the top of the camera, so I can get a nice high angle, and get the shot I need and know that I got the shot I need without having to take it, look at it, and make adjustments. So you have that, you still have your waist level, you know, which even though it comes to the side, a lot of people don't like that for waist level. I don't mind it because I will typically, when I'm shooting like that, have my left hand to the lens anyway. So it kind of cradles in with my left arm, and it's not really noticeable. It's not in danger of getting bumped. It's fine, right? And definitely when you're shooting like that, that's absolutely fine. Kind of help that, use that as kind of a little bit of extra stabilization on the left side of your arm. And then, of course, if you need to shoot up or shoot around the corner if you want to, right, you can do all of that. So I really like the idea of the flippy screen here. I know a lot of people, especially in the Fuji world, hate and detest that because it kind of, I guess, gives them a cheap camera or modern or, you know, camcorder type feel. But I think it's very functional, and the ability to close it in and, you know, have that screen protected and just out of the way when I don't need it. You know, I put into bags. I'm not worried about scratching anything. I'm not going to get a screen protector for this. I love that, which is a big reason why I was looking to pick this camera up. You know, when Sony finally made a smaller body like this compared to their bigger Alpha series, Alpha 7 series. And so when they finally made it small like this and they put that screen in it, to me, I had to check it out. And I do use it and love it just as much as I thought I would. So, you know, and one more comment on that. Let me just pull this camera down real quick to show you. You know, I've had this camera for a while. Don't really use it much. Actually, my wife bought it and she never used it. But this little, I think this is a NEX 5T. My first Sony camera was actually the NEX 7 back when that was released. And I kind of loved that experience, and it was just mind-boggling even back then that Sony was putting a full, you know, APS-C sensor in the body this small, right? That to me was just crazy. I mean, if you look at the mount on this, it's bigger than the actual body. It actually extends past the edges of this. So even back then, I thought that was kind of crazy. So for them to come kind of full circle, and of course in a bigger body, kind of be able to pull the full frame off in a similar profile, a similar form factor, to me is just, it's mind-boggling, and I really like the idea of this camera. At some point in the future, I'll probably do an actual review on this. I just got this not too long ago, so I'm just kind of learning with it and shooting with it more. So don't really have a whole lot of thoughts on it yet, but I do like what I see. I've shot the a7 III for, I think I maybe had that camera for 2 years, so I'm very familiar with the output of that sensor, and it's great, it's amazing. So I kind of knew what I was getting, but in a form factor that is more akin to what I typically like, right, with this rangefinder style camera. So I just wanted to kind of bring it back to that before I logged off this video, and make the point about the back screen shooting experience between these three cameras and some of the features that their different approaches enable for you. So other than that, I will sign back off and actually say goodbye this time. Thank you for watching once again. See you soon.